Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going on an incredible evolutionary journey. We're going to trace the history of how we learn, how we think, and ultimately, how we uncover the truth. We're looking at a pedagogical powerhouse that has literally survived for millennia. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of this ancient framework, I want you to step out of your role as a passive listener just for a second and really step into the mindset of an active participant.
Seriously, look at this question and ask yourself, what is the true nature of knowledge? If you claim to know something, how do you actually prove it? Are you just repeating facts you've memorized, or do you possess a deep, structural understanding of the concept? This isn't just a rhetorical warm-up, guys. This exact demand for profound clarity is the beating heart of our topic today.
Okay, let's dive into this. The Socratic Method, which is rooted in the teachings of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, is essentially an educational and philosophical practice. It emphasizes the relentless use of questions to stimulate critical thinking, drawing out your underlying ideas and exposing those hidden presumptions we all have. And what's really amazing here is that this dialogic method dates back thousands of years to ancient Athens, yet, as you'll see, it remains one of the most highly relevant and effective tools we use today.
So, here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll trace the evolution of this method through 6 quick steps: defining the Socratic quest, Elenchus and intellectual midwifery, Wittgenstein's Socratic connection, high school Socratic seminars, law school Socratic rigor, and finally, the future of AI tutors.
All right, starting off with part 1, defining the Socratic quest. And this brilliantly illustrates the core of it. When Socrates engaged in a dialogue, he brought some major underlying assumptions to the table. Most notably, he assumed that virtue itself is a form of moral knowledge. This made philosophical inquiry a morally therapeutic act, something literally designed to help someone live a better life. But he held a really strict standard for this knowledge. It's called the articulation condition. This states that if you are truly knowledgeable about a subject, you absolutely must be able to offer a clear definition of it. It's simple, but man, is it demanding. Like if you're an expert at tying a square knot, you need to be able to explain exactly how to tie a square knot. By the same token, if you claim to be a truly courageous person, you have to be able to define exactly what courage is. You can't just point to an example of someone doing something brave, you have to articulate the essential nature of the thing itself.
Moving right along to section 2, Elenchus and intellectual midwifery.
So how did Socrates actually extract these definitions from his conversation partners? Well, he used a rigorous cross-examination process known as the Elenchus. This process had a double purpose. First, to discover philosophical truths about how we ought to live, and second, to simultaneously test the partner to see if they were actually living a moral, consistent life. As outlined by the philosopher Gregory Vlastos, we can break this standard pattern down into 4 precise steps. First, the conversation partner or interlocutor asserts a thesis, something they believe to be true. Second, Socrates methodically asks questions to secure their agreement on further, seemingly independent premises. Third, Socrates argues, and the partner agrees, that these new premises actually entail a logical contradiction to their original thesis. And boom, step 4. The original thesis is exposed as false. It's a rigorous cross-examination that forces people to confront the inconsistencies in their own belief systems.
But here's the thing. Socrates didn't view himself as some harsh interrogator. Instead, he used this amazing metaphor of maieutic in Plato's Theaetetus dialogue. He described himself as an intellectual midwife. Socrates actually claimed that he himself was intellectually barren. He didn't have all the answers to just force onto his students. Instead, his questioning was meant to diagnose the pains of their intellectual labor, helping them birth their own latent knowledge. Then, he rigorously tested that brainchild to see if it was viable, or if it was just a flawed contradiction that needed to be thrown out.
Now let's jump to section 3, Wittgenstein's Socratic connection.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the contrast. Jumping forward to the 20th century, we see a brilliant evolution of this concept by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He adapted this ancient intellectual midwifery for his very own philosophical inquiries. But there's a really distinct difference in their end goals. Socrates, as we saw with the articulation condition, sought essential definitions and exact, overarching philosophical truths. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, felt that searching for strict, absolute definitions often caused philosophical confusion. Actually, instead of looking for a single overarching truth, Wittgenstein used therapeutic dialogic methods to cure linguistic confusion. So he acted as a midwife, not to birth absolute definitions, but to lead words back from their abstract metaphysical heights down to their everyday use in regular language. He wanted to unearth the implicit, familiar knowledge his conversation partners already had, but had somehow lost track of.
That brings us to Section 4, High School Socratic Seminars.
So, the crucial point is, shifting gears from high-level philosophy to modern classrooms, secondary schools use student-centered Socratic seminars to foster critical thinking. And rather than the traditional lecture format where a teacher just dispenses facts to acquire room, in this environment, the teacher entirely relinquishes their traditional authority. They become a mere facilitator. But for this to work, students really have to follow specific, collaborative rules to sustain the dialogue. They've got to come prepared with annotated texts, address their peers instead of always looking to the teacher for validation, ask probing follow-up questions, disagree respectfully without attacking the person, and keep their points brief so everyone gets a chance to participate.
To physically encourage this kind of dynamic, teachers will often use setups like the fishbowl method. It's pretty cool. In a fishbowl, half the class forms an inner circle and actively engages in the Socratic dialogue. Meanwhile, the other half forms an outer circle. They observe, silently, take notes, and track the flow of the conversation without interfering at all. Then, after a set time, the groups swap roles. It's a brilliant physical arrangement because it deeply encourages peer-to-peer engagement and self-correction, all without the teacher having to step in.
Moving on to Section 5, Law School's Socratic Rigor.
But what happens when the stakes get a bit higher? Let's transition from those collaborative high school environments to the intense, highly teacher-directed application of the method used in top-tier law schools. Now, you might be familiar with the Hollywood myth of the terrorizing law professor ruthlessly breaking down a student. Think of Professor Kingsfield in The Paper Chase. But as the University of Chicago Law School puts it perfectly here, the true goal is to develop critical thinking skills in students and enable them to approach the law as intellectuals. The goal isn't humiliation, no way. It's highly participatory learning. It's about training future lawyers to reason by analogy and engage in rigorous, real-world problem-solving under serious pressure.
A really key concept here is productive discomfort. Let's be honest, being called on randomly in front of a massive lecture hall and being forced to articulate your reasoning on the spot, that is terrifying. Making mistakes in that public arena is absolutely inevitable. But that productive discomfort is a vital part of the learning process. It teaches law students how to analyze messy, imperfect legal issues, revise their own ideas in real time when they're confronted with new information, and develop the thick skin they're going to need for the courtroom.
And finally, let's move to Section 6, the future, AI tutors, and see how this all builds together. This ancient framework is literally building the absolute cutting edge of education today. We're looking at a future right now where artificial intelligence is being trained to emulate this exact Socratic questioning. Modern AI-driven tutoring systems, which are powered by these massive large language models, are essentially being resurrected as digital intellectual midwives. Rather than just handing a student the answer to a math problem or a history question, these systems are actually programmed to use the instructional function of dialogue. They intentionally lead a student through a structured maze of questioning and guidance, forcing them to formulate their own understandings and arrive at the right answer through their own cognitive labor. It's a real game changer.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. If an AI can truly master the Socratic method, if it becomes the perfect intellectual midwife, is the wisdom it uncovers in us truly ours, or does it belong to the machine that guided us there? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really challenge you to carry this question with you today and think about how this ancient, relentless pursuit of knowledge will survive and adapt in the automation age. Keep questioning and keep learning.